I knew something was wrong the second my wife dropped her phone into the sink like it had burned her. It didn't just slip out of her hand. She threw it down so fast that water splashed across the counter. And then she looked at me with this wild, frozen expression I had never seen in 10 years of marriage. I remember laughing at first because I thought maybe I had caught her ordering me some terrible birthday gift or gossiping about one of our neighbors. But then she said, "Why are you home early?" in this sharp, panicked voice that made my stomach drop before my brain even caught up. I stood there with my laptop bag still hanging off my shoulder, staring at her wet phone, staring at her face, and feeling that awful click inside my chest. That instant where your whole life shifts half an inch and you somehow know nothing is safe anymore. I told her the meeting got canceled, that I figured I'd surprise her and maybe we could grab lunch together. And instead of smiling like she always used to, she snatched the phone out of the sink, turned it face down, and said, "You should have texted first." That sentence hit me harder than I can explain because it sounded less like a wife talking to her husband and more like someone angry that she hadn't been given time to hide something. I tried to play it off, but I could feel myself watching every movement she made after that, every twitch in her jaw, every second her eyes avoided mine. She kept talking too much, filling the silence with nonsense about grocery delivery times and her mother's doctor appointment. And then, in the middle of that nervous rambling, her smartwatch lit up on her wrist. I only saw it for a second, just long enough to read, "Miss you already." No name, no context, just that. She slapped her hand over the screen so fast it was almost violent, then gave me this tight little smile and said, "Work stuff. Work stuff." I actually remember nodding like an idiot while something cold and humiliating spread through my whole body. The rest of that afternoon felt like I was standing outside my own marriage, watching it through glass. She kept acting offended that I seemed distant, like I was the one making the house feel strange, and every time I looked at her, I heard that stupid message in my head. "Miss you already." Who says that to a married woman in the middle of the day? And why did she react like she'd been caught with a weapon? By dinner, she was suddenly extra sweet, touching my shoulder, asking about my day, laughing too hard at things that weren't funny, and it was so transparent it almost made me sick. Then came the part that really twisted the knife. She said she needed to go stay with her sister for the night because she's having a rough time and doesn't want to be alone. My wife said it while looking me dead in the eye, calm and practiced, like the lie had been rehearsed. I asked, "Since when does your sister call you after ignoring you for 2 weeks?" And she didn't even flinch. She just crossed her arms and said, "You're being paranoid again." Again. That word stayed with me because it meant she already had a script for this version of me. The suspicious husband, the difficult husband, the man whose instincts could be dismissed before he even finished a sentence. I should have let it go. I should have been the bigger man, or the trusting husband, or whatever people say when they've never stood in a kitchen feeling their dignity drain out of them one drop at a time. But after she left, I did something I never thought I'd do. I opened the cabinet above the refrigerator to grab a glass, and a second phone fell out and hit the counter so hard I actually jumped. I just stood there staring at it, not breathing, because my wife had told me for years that people who snoop always regret what they find. And suddenly, I understood why. The screen lit up on impact, and there on the lock screen was a picture of my wife smiling in a selfie I had never seen, and underneath it a message that made my hands go numb. It wasn't from a stranger. It wasn't from some random guy. It was from my younger brother, and all it said was, "He suspect anything?" I thought seeing my brother's name on that screen was the moment my marriage died. I was wrong, because what came right after that was somehow even worse. One message turned my fear into something uglier than heartbreak, because suddenly I wasn't just wondering whether my wife was lying to me. I was wondering how long the two people I trusted most had been standing in the same room with me, smiling in my face, while I played the fool. I picked up that phone like it might explode in my hand, and for a second I actually hoped there was some stupid explanation, some absurd misunderstanding I would be embarrassed about later. But the second the screen unlocked, whatever was left of my denial collapsed. There were weeks of messages, maybe months, and they didn't read like two people crossing a line by accident. They read like two people who had built a whole secret world and gotten comfortable inside it. My brother kept asking about my schedule, asking whether I was home, whether I had noticed anything, whether he's still buying it. And every line felt like a knife turning slower than it needed to. Then there were her messages, and somehow hers hurt more, because I know the rhythm of the way she talks. I know how her words sound when she's teasing, when she's annoyed, when she's trying to charm someone. And there it all was, just redirected away from me like I had already been erased. The thing that really broke me was how casual she sounded. No guilt, no panic, no sign that she was risking a marriage and tearing apart a family. Just calm little lies, smooth little updates, almost bored in the way she talked about me, like I was an obstacle to manage rather than a husband she was betraying. I sat there at the kitchen counter hearing the refrigerator hum, hearing my own breathing get rough and uneven, and I kept thinking, I had both of them in this house. I poured drinks for him. I defended her to friends when they said she'd become cold. I actually defended both of them while they were making me look like a man too blind to protect his own life. I should have called her right then. I should have called my brother and demanded he explain himself. Instead, I kept scrolling, because by that point pain had turned into obsession, and obsession makes you keep touching the wound even when you know it is only going to bleed more. That was when I found the part that made my whole body go cold. They weren't just talking about me in the present. They were talking about a night 3 months earlier, the night I broke down in front of my brother after one of the worst fights my wife and I had ever had. I remember sitting in his car outside a bar, telling him I felt like I was losing her, telling him I did not know how to reach her anymore, and I remember him putting a hand on my shoulder and saying, "You're overthinking it, man. She loves you. You just need to stop spiraling." I trusted that. I leaned on that. And now here he was, in these messages, joking with her about how easy I was to calm down, telling her he bought every word I said. I actually said no out loud when I read that. Just one word into an empty kitchen, because it felt impossible that humiliation could have layers this deep. Then my phone rang, and her name lit up the screen. I stared at it while it buzzed in my hand, and when I finally answered, she didn't even say hello. She said, "Have you been in the cabinet above the fridge?" Her voice was low and controlled, too controlled, like she was already managing the story before I had spoken a word. I asked her why she would even ask me that, and she went silent for one beat too long before saying, "Because if you touch something that wasn't yours, we're going to have a very different conversation tonight." Not panic, not remorse, a threat. I felt this sick, hollow pressure in my chest, because in that moment I understood something I had been avoiding all day. She wasn't scared of losing me. She was scared of losing control. And before I could answer, before I could even decide whether to confront her or keep pretending, I heard another voice in the background on her end of the call, close enough to the phone that it sounded like he was standing right beside her. My brother laughed softly and said, "Did he find it?" I thought hearing his voice in the background was the worst kind of confirmation I could get. I was wrong, because the silence that came after it said more than anything they could have admitted out loud. That one moment, that one careless sentence, stripped away every last excuse I had been clinging to and left me standing there with the truth in its rawest, ugliest form. I didn't say anything right away, and I think that unsettled her more than if I had started yelling, because she filled the silence quickly, her voice sharpening as she said my name twice like she was trying to pull me back into whatever version of reality she preferred. I finally asked, very quietly, "Why is he there?" And for a second, just a second, I heard something crack in her composure before it snapped right back into place. She let out this small, irritated breath and said, "You're making something out of nothing. He just stopped by to check on me because I told him we argued." I remember gripping the edge of the counter so hard my fingers started to ache, because even now, even with everything sitting in front of me, she was still trying to rewrite the moment as if I hadn't just heard him with my own ears. I told her I had the phone, and that was when the tone shifted completely. The softness disappeared, the defensiveness turned cold, And she said, "You went through my things?" Like that was the real betrayal here. Not the lies, not the messages, not my own brother standing beside her while I stood alone in our kitchen. Me. I was the problem because I looked. I wish I could say I stayed calm, that I handled it with dignity, but something inside me finally snapped under the weight of it all, and I said his name out loud, slow and deliberate, and asked her how long, not if, not why, just how long. There was this long pause, heavy and suffocating, and then she said, "You're not ready for that conversation." Not denial, not even a weak attempt to lie. Just control again, like she was deciding what I was allowed to know and when. I started laughing then, and it didn't sound like me. It sounded hollow and sharp, like it belonged to someone watching their own life fall apart from a distance. I told her I had already seen enough, that I knew about the messages, about the way they talked about me, and that was when she said something that I don't think I will ever forget for as long as I live. She said, "If you hadn't been so distant, none of this would have happened." Just like that, clean, simple, as if my confusion, my attempts to understand her, my patience through months of her pulling away, were somehow the cause of all of this. I hung up before I said something I couldn't take back, but the damage was already done, not just by what she had admitted, but by how easily she shifted the weight of it onto me. I stood there for a long time after the call ended, staring at that second phone like it had rewritten every memory I thought I understood. And then my own phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't her. It was my brother. I don't know why I opened the message. Maybe because part of me still wanted to believe there was some version of him that would explain this in a way that made sense. But the second I read it, whatever was left of that hope collapsed completely. He didn't apologize. He didn't even try to deny it. All he wrote was, "We were going to tell you eventually. You just weren't supposed to find out like this." And as I stared at those words, trying to process how betrayal could be dressed up as something almost reasonable, another message came in right after it that made my stomach drop even further. "Also, there's something else you don't know about her, and you're not going to like it." I thought I had reached the bottom of it when my brother admitted everything without even trying to fight it. I was wrong, because the way he said, "there's something else," felt heavier than everything I had already seen, like I was only standing at the edge of something much deeper and darker than I was ready for. I stared at his message for a long time, longer than I want to admit, because part of me didn't want to ask, didn't want to pull on that thread and watch the last pieces of my life unravel completely. But I already knew I wasn't going to be able to stop myself. My hands were shaking when I finally typed back, just 2 words, "What else?" And I remember thinking how small that question looked compared to the weight behind it. He didn't respond right away, and those few minutes stretched into something unbearable, my mind racing through every possible scenario, each one worse than the last, until my phone finally buzzed again. I opened it immediately, almost desperately, and what I read didn't make sense at first. He wrote, "You remember that trip she took last year? The one she said was for work?" I felt my chest tighten because of course I remembered it. I had helped her pack. I had driven her to the airport. I had even joked about how quiet the house would feel without her. I told him yes, and then the next message came in, slower this time, like even he understood the weight of what he was about to say. It wasn't for work. She wasn't alone either. I actually had to sit down because my legs felt weak in a way I had never experienced before, like my body was finally catching up to what my mind was trying to process. I asked him who, and for a moment I thought maybe he would finally show some kind of restraint, some hint that there was a line he wouldn't cross, but instead he doubled down in the most detached way possible. He said, "It started before me." Just that. No apology, no hesitation, just another piece of truth dropped into my hands like it was nothing. I could feel something inside me breaking in a slower, quieter way now. Not explosive like before, but deeper, more permanent. This wasn't one betrayal. It wasn't even 2. It was a pattern, something that had been happening behind my back while I was still standing there believing I was part of a stable, real marriage. I asked him how long, and he finally gave me a number. Over a year. Over a year. I repeated it out loud to myself because I needed to hear how it sounded, needed to feel the weight of it land fully, and it made everything else shift in my memory. Every late night, every sudden mood change, every time she told me I was imagining things, all of it started rearranging itself into something that made a horrible kind of sense. And then, just when I thought I couldn't feel anything worse than that, he sent one more message. You really don't remember that night, do you? I frowned at the screen, confused for a second, because there were so many nights, so many arguments, so many blurred edges where things had felt off. But before I could even ask him what he meant, he followed it up with something that made my heart stop completely. The night you thought you drank too much and passed out, you didn't. She just needed you out of the way. I thought I had already relived every painful memory in our marriage through a new, broken lens. I was wrong, because that one sentence dragged me back into a night I had buried, a night I had explained away, a night that suddenly didn't belong to me anymore. I sat there staring at my brother's message, my mind scrambling to grab onto something solid, something real. But all it found was that night replaying in fragments I didn't trust anymore. I remembered coming home exhausted. I remembered her being strangely attentive, almost overly kind, offering me a drink before I even asked, smiling in a way that felt warm at the time, but now made my stomach twist. I remembered feeling unusually heavy, like the room had tilted just slightly off balance, like my body wasn't fully mine, and I remembered apologizing to her, actually apologizing for being too tired, for ruining the evening, before I stumbled into bed and everything went black. I had woken up the next morning with that dull, disoriented feeling, and she had laughed it off, told me I couldn't handle stress the way I used to, told me I needed to take better care of myself, and I believed her. I trusted her explanation more than I trusted my own instincts, because that's what I had been trained to do over time. Now, sitting in that same house, holding that same truth in my hands, I felt something colder than anger settle in my chest. I texted him back, "What do you mean?" even though I already understood more than I wanted to. His reply came quickly this time, like the hesitation was gone, like he had already crossed too many lines to care anymore. She didn't want you around that night. She said it would be easier if you just went to sleep. I read that message over and over again, each time hoping the words would rearrange themselves into something less horrifying, but they stayed exactly the same. Easier if you just went to sleep. I felt my hands start to shake again, but this time it wasn't just pain. It was something else, something heavier, something that made my chest feel tight in a way that scared me. I wasn't just betrayed. I was handled, managed, removed. I had become an obstacle in my own home, and she had found a way to move me out of the way without even having to argue with me. I thought back to every moment I had defended her, every time I had told myself she was just distant, just overwhelmed, just misunderstood. And now all of it felt like I had been willingly blindfolded while she quietly rearranged our entire life behind my back. I tried to call her again, not because I expected honesty, but because I needed to hear her voice, needed to confront the reality of who she had become, or maybe who she had always been. But this time she didn't answer. It rang and rang until it went to voicemail, and I didn't leave a message because I didn't even know what words could possibly hold everything I was feeling. Instead, I sat there in the quiet, listening to the faint hum of the house, and that was when something else hit me, something I hadn't even considered yet. I opened that second phone again, my movements slower now, more deliberate, and I started going through the older messages, the ones I had skipped in my panic earlier. That was when I noticed a pattern. Something small at first, just dates and times that didn't quite line up with the story she had been telling me for months. Nights she claimed she was with friends. Evenings she said she was working late. Little gaps in our life that I had ignored because I trusted her. But one date stopped me cold. It was the night of our anniversary. The night we had gone out to dinner. The night she had held my hand across the table. looked me in the eyes, and told me she was grateful for me, that she couldn't imagine her life without me. I remember that night so clearly because I had felt, for the first time in months, like we were finding our way back to each other. But according to the messages on that phone, that wasn't the only thing that happened that night. There was a gap, a window of time after dinner that didn't make sense anymore. And right under that date was a message from her to my brother that made my chest feel like it was caving in. He actually believed tonight was about us. I thought that message about our anniversary was the moment everything inside me finally gave out. I was wrong, because what came next didn't just break my heart. It made me question whether anything in my marriage had ever been real at all. I kept staring at that line, reading it over and over again like my brain refused to accept it, because that night had meant something to me. It had felt like a turning point, like we were rebuilding something fragile but real. And now I was sitting there realizing I had been the only one living in that moment. I could still see her across the table, the way she smiled softly, the way she squeezed my hand and said, "We're going to be okay." And I remember how relieved I felt hearing that, how I let myself believe her without hesitation. And now here was the truth, sitting cold and undeniable in front of me, showing me that while I was holding on to hope, she was already somewhere else emotionally, already sharing that version of herself with someone who wasn't me. I felt this deep, hollow ache in my chest, like something had been scooped out and replaced with nothing, and I didn't even have the strength to be angry anymore, just tired in a way that went deeper than anything physical. But I still couldn't stop digging, because by that point I needed to know how far this went, how much of my life had been quietly rewritten without my knowledge. I scrolled further back, slower now, bracing myself for each new piece of truth. And that was when I started noticing something that didn't fit the pattern I had already accepted. There were gaps where my brother wasn't the one she was talking to. Different tone, different rhythm. Messages that felt more cautious, more calculated. I frowned, trying to make sense of it, and then I found a name I didn't recognize at all. No contact picture, no saved details. Just a number and a thread of conversations that looked even older than anything with my brother. My heart started pounding again, not with shock this time, but with something closer to dread, because I realized I had been thinking in terms of one betrayal stacked on top of another, when in reality I might have been looking at something much bigger, something that had been going on long before either of us noticed the cracks in our marriage. I opened that thread, and the first thing I saw was a message from her that made my stomach drop in a completely different way. It wasn't casual. It wasn't playful. It was careful, almost strategic. He still doesn't remember anything from that night. I felt my breath catch because suddenly this wasn't just about distance or lies or even betrayal in the way I had understood it before. This was about control. About manipulation on a level I hadn't even considered. I scrolled further, my hands cold now, and every message pulled me deeper into something I didn't recognize anymore. They talked about timing, about planning, about keeping stories consistent, and then I saw something that made everything in me go still. There was a photo. I didn't recognize where it was taken at first, just a dimly lit room, unfamiliar furniture. But then my eyes adjusted, and I realized why it felt so wrong. It wasn't unfamiliar at all. It was our bedroom, our bed. And in the corner of that photo, barely visible but unmistakable once you saw it, was me, lying there, still, unaware. And right beneath that photo was a message from that unknown number that made my entire world tilt in a way I don't think I will ever recover from. You said he'd never find out. I thought I had already seen the worst possible version of my life laid out in front of me. I was wrong, because that photo didn't just show betrayal. It showed something I couldn't even fully process at first, something that made everything else feel smaller by comparison. I don't remember breathing for a few seconds after I saw it. I just stared at the screen, trying to convince myself I was misinterpreting it, that my eyes were playing some kind of cruel trick on me. But the longer I looked, the clearer it became. That was our bedroom. That was my side of the bed. And that was me, lying there like I didn't exist, like I had been reduced to background noise in my own life. I could feel my heart pounding in my ears, loud and uneven, as I scrolled up through that conversation, my mind struggling to catch up with what I was seeing. They weren't just talking about hiding things from me. They were coordinating, adjusting stories, making sure details lined up. It wasn't chaos or emotion driving any of this. It was deliberate, careful, planned in a way that made my skin feel cold. I kept going, even though every instinct in me was screaming to stop, because I needed to understand who this person was, how deep this went, how many layers of my life had been quietly rewritten without me ever realizing it. And then I found it. A name buried further up in the thread, mentioned casually like it wasn't something that should shatter me completely. It was someone I knew, not just someone I knew, someone I had trusted in a completely different way. Our neighbor, the one who had helped us move into this house, the one who had stood in our kitchen drinking coffee with me, talking about renovations, laughing about how thin the walls were in this neighborhood. I remember gripping the phone so tightly my fingers started to hurt, because suddenly every casual interaction, every friendly conversation, every moment that had once felt normal was being pulled apart and reassembled into something else entirely. I whispered his name out loud like saying it might somehow make it less real, but it didn't. Nothing did. And then, as if things hadn't already crossed every line I thought existed, I noticed something else in that thread that made my stomach drop even further. Dates, repeated dates, times when I wasn't even in town, work trips, conferences, nights I had called home and she told me she missed me, that she wished I was there, that the house felt empty without me. I felt this wave of nausea hit me so suddenly I had to sit back, pressing my hand against my mouth like I could physically hold everything in. It wasn't just happening around me. It was happening because I wasn't there. My absence wasn't a coincidence. It was an opportunity. My phone buzzed again, and I almost didn't look at it because I didn't think I could take another message, another piece of this unraveling truth. But something in me needed to see it through. It was her this time. Just one sentence. "We need to talk when I get back." I stared at those words, feeling something shift inside me again. Not breaking this time, but hardening. Because for the first time since all of this started, I realized something that scared me in a completely different way. She still thought she was in control of this. And as I sat there in that quiet house, surrounded by a life that no longer felt like mine, I looked back down at that second phone, at all the messages, all the lies, all the carefully constructed deception, and I noticed one final detail I had somehow missed until now. A contact at the very top of her messages, pinned above everyone else. Not my brother, not the neighbor, just a single word. Lawyer. I thought seeing lawyer pinned at the top of her messages was the final piece, the last confirmation that everything I had believed in was already being dismantled behind my back. I was wrong, because what I found inside that conversation didn't just prove she was planning an exit. It proved she had been preparing to destroy me long before I even realized I was under attack. I opened that thread slowly, almost carefully, like I was bracing for impact, and the first thing I noticed wasn't emotion, it was structure. Dates, documents, questions that weren't about feelings, but about strategy. She wasn't asking how to fix a marriage or how to separate peacefully. She was asking how to position herself, how to protect her interests, how to establish patterns of instability. I remember my eyes locking onto that phrase because it didn't make sense at first, not until I read further and saw my name woven into those discussions in a way that made my chest feel tight. She had been describing me to this lawyer, not as a husband, not even as a person, but as a problem to be managed. She talked about my stress, about the nights I had struggled to sleep, about the one time I raised my voice during an argument and immediately apologized, twisting it into something that sounded volatile and unpredictable. And the worst part was how calculated it all felt. She wasn't just telling her side of the story, she was building a case. I kept scrolling, even though every line made me feel smaller, more exposed, like parts of my life I thought were private had been quietly handed over and reshaped into something unrecognizable. Then I saw messages about finances, accounts I didn't know about, transfers labeled in ways that would never raise suspicion if I hadn't been looking for them. My stomach dropped again as I realized she hadn't just been emotionally pulling away from me. She had been slowly separating our lives in ways I never noticed, setting things aside, creating distance in places I couldn't see. It wasn't impulsive, it wasn't messy, it was patient. And that patience scared me more than anything else, because it meant she had been thinking about this for a long time while I was still trying to figure out why she felt distant at dinner. But then I found the message that made everything else feel like it had just been leading up to this. It was from the lawyer, and it was blunt in a way nothing else had been. If you can demonstrate a pattern of compromised awareness, it will significantly strengthen your position. I didn't understand it at first, not fully, until I saw her response right underneath. There are already a few incidents that could support that. Incidents. My mind immediately went back to that night. The one I couldn't fully remember, the one she had laughed off, the one my brother had just reframed into something much darker. And suddenly all those scattered pieces started locking into place in a way that made my chest feel like it was collapsing inward. This wasn't just about betrayal. This wasn't just about lies. This was about narrative, about control, about making me look like someone who couldn't be trusted with his own reality. I don't know how long I sat there after that, staring at the screen, feeling like I was slipping out of my own life, like everything I thought I understood about myself was being quietly rewritten without my consent. And then my phone buzzed again. Another message from her. "I'm on my way home." Just that. Calm. Simple. Like this was just another normal night. Like we were about to sit down and talk through something ordinary. But it wasn't ordinary anymore. Nothing was. Because now I knew something she didn't. She thought I was still confused, still in the dark, still trying to piece things together, but I wasn't. And as I sat there in that silence, waiting for the sound of her key in the door, one thought kept repeating in my head, louder than anything else. I wasn't the one about to lose everything anymore.